Yeah, got that part down. Okay, hello everyone. Um, Thank you for coming today. So we are going to continue with Unit 6. So you should have seen already there was an important announcement about Unit 6 and Test 3, but I will chat to you about that in a moment. Let me just see if I can start sharing my screen. Okay. On the live stream, can you see my screen now?
We can, yes, thank you.
Great. So the important announcement was that your test 3, remember in the last lecture I said test 3 is going to be based on one of the prescribed journal articles. The specific article that it is going to be based on is the one about female school principals. So that is the article you can start preparing for test 3. So test 3 will be based on that article. The questions will be about that article. So you need to make sure you've read it before you do the test. You've read it more than one time. You understand all the words. You understand what it's about. And you're prepared to now answer questions about it. So there are questions about the article itself, but there are also questions that more test the other skills that we've learned in ACL. Next week, we will do a practice test. So I'll give you a practice test so you can see what sorts of questions to expect. So you will go into test 3 quite comfortable and knowing exactly what to expect because you will have done practice and you will have been able to read that article and take notes and all of that. So that article, remember, is in your course reader. So please make sure that you are reading that. And then I asked you before this class to read through both of those journal articles in your course reader. So who has done that? Has anyone read through those articles? All right. When you were researching for your assignment 1 plan, who used a journal article for assignment 1? Everyone should have because it was a requirement. Okay, so how did you go about reading the article and looking for information? And this would be with journal articles, but any text really. How do you get information out of a text? I'm going to randomly pick on people. Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. So she said she browsed through the articles. So she looked over them quite quickly and then focused in on the sections that looked like they could help her with her topic. So that is one way we can extract information. How did you go about getting information? So she says what she did was she read through the article, she took the points that would be useful for her side of the argument and summarized them so that she could then use them in her essay. So both of these are actually different kind of strategies that we're going to talk about in today's lecture. So we're really going to focus in on differentiating between reading strategies and seeing when you should use each type of strategy. But what you'll notice is that naturally or in kind of without learning this, you've probably already been doing it before. So you've probably already used these to varying levels as you have tried to understand text. So the reason we're going to go through it is so that you can be exposed to other methods that you might not have known before and that could make your life easier. And also to kind of distinguish between when a strategy is useful and when it isn't, so that you know when you should be using each kind of strategy. Oh, don't know why that's there. So when we read information, we could have a variety of different reasons as to why we are reading that particular text. And so the reading strategy that we use needs to be based on the purpose, so why we are reading that particular text. So for instance, when you need to get an overview, then it's actually quite acceptable and quite useful to rather browse the text as you did, or we'll call it skimming and scanning. Whereas if you were trying to read for study purposes, so because you're going to be tested on a particular chapter, you wouldn't be able to do that sort of reading. You would need to have a deeper reading strategy so that you would be able to remember all of the information before you got tested on it. So these are just some examples of reasons we might have to read a text. And in particular, we're going to focus on when you're reading for research, so looking for texts to use in an assignment, and reading for study purposes, so reading when you need to actually remember what you've read because you're going to be tested on it. And I'm going to show you ways to do those two kind of things. So in particular, we're going to look at surveying, skimming, scanning, and synthesizing. And we can kind of arrange them according to how fast you can do them. So surveying is the quickest way to have a look at a text. Then comes skimming, then scanning, and by the time we get to synthesizing, that's when it's taking quite a long time to do that particular strategy, and you're spending a lot of time with the text. So let's start with surveying. So when we survey, this is kind of what you were doing when you're going through texts and you're trying to figure out what is relevant and what isn't. And you're going to do this a lot when you're researching for a particular topic or assignment. So what you might have found when you were trying to find sources for assignment 1 is that you opened a couple of articles or books or other texts and you kind of had a quick look at them, realized, oh, this is off topic, and then moved on. And that would be when we survey a text. So we're really just trying to figure out, is it worth reading the whole thing? Or should I move on and rather look for something else? So this is really useful because when you're researching, you don't want to read in depth every single article, and then it turns out that only 1 or 2 of them were actually relevant, and now you've spent all this time deeply reading articles that just weren't important. So this is a strategy you're going to use to help you select what sources to use. So when we do it, we really just focus on a few aspects of the text. So we look at the title and the abstract if it's a journal article. You look at the different headings and subheadings. And you might just read the first and last paragraph to just get a sense of what the main points are. With a book, you would read again the title. Books don't have abstracts, so we'd maybe read the blurb on the back cover. And you'd have a look at the contents page and see if there are any particular chapters that talk to your topic. If the book has an index, which would be at the back, an index is where they arrange all the different topics that are covered in alphabetical order. So, for instance, you could look in the index of a book and see if they have as one of the topics code switching. Then you would know, okay, this book is going to cover that. And it tells you what pages address that topic. And then you know, okay, I'm just going to read those pages because those are the ones that are going to deal with my specific topic. And often an academic book in the introduction gives an overview or summary of each chapter. So they tell you the main point of each different chapter, especially in edited collections. So books where there's an editor, but each chapter has a different author. In the introduction, they're usually going to tell you, okay, so this chapter written by so-and-so, this is the main point. And so when you read through the introduction, you can select which chapters am I going to read and which chapters am I just going to leave out and not get into. So you can see this is more of a time-saving mechanism. So when you are short on time, it's really helpful. But also, even if you've started an assignment way before the deadline, you still don't want to be wasting your time on irrelevant sources because you could also confuse yourself. So this is kind of what you should do with assignments. Before you fully read any particular text, you should survey it like this and get an idea of whether it's relevant or not. So skimming is quite similar to surveying, but it's a little more detailed. So we're usually going to use skimming if you've surveyed an article and you're kind of got the sense that, okay, I don't think this is relevant, but you're not sure. So then you have a bit of a closer look to check, is it relevant, is it not? So it's a bit of a closer look, but it's still not a full read. Or if you've got a text and you just want the main point, you don't want to get into the nitty gritty, you just want to see what is the main conclusion, what is the main outcome of this particular thing, then you would also skim. So when we skim, we've already done surveying, right? So we've already looked at the title, we've looked at the abstract, looked at the index, if it's a book, we've looked at the chapters, if it's a book. So we've already got a bit of an idea. Now we're going a little deeper. And so in an article, what you would do then is you've already read the introduction and the conclusion. So now in the paragraphs, you would read the first sentence and the last sentence of the paragraphs and kind of let your eyes search for the key words that you're looking for based on your topic. So when we read the first sentence, we're actually looking usually at the topic sentence of a paragraph. And as you know from writing your assignments or the assignment one plan, the topic sentence is the main idea of a paragraph. So we actually learn a lot about a paragraph just from knowing the topic sentence, which is usually the first sentence. And so only if that paragraph seems relevant would we then go and look at all the supporting details for that topic sentence. So I think I've repeated here. Okay. So we've done surveying. Sorry, I confused my words earlier. So first one is surveying, then it's skimming, then scanning. So scanning is when you really are just looking for those keywords or key topic words. So that's where you are looking for specific information. And the picture on the screen of the zigzag, that's kind of what you're doing with your eyes. You're moving over the text in kind of a zigzag pattern so that you get an overview. And if you see the keyword, then you can focus in and read around the keyword. But you're not reading anything except for the parts that have those keywords. So we're usually going to use this when, you've read an article and now you've got to the point where you want to refer to it in your assignment or essay. And you know that there was a good point in this article, but you can't remember where it was. So now you're just going to do this zigzag motion until you find what you're looking for. Then you'd read that and add it in for your assignment. Or again, when you're just looking for your particular topic words in a piece of information that might cover a variety of topics. So for an example, I do my research on resentment, right? But often articles talk about envy and resentment together. So I use this method a lot because I'll do this with my eyes and pick up the word resentment and read all the paragraphs that are about resentment and ignore all the paragraphs that are about envy. So you will find when you're researching a specific topic, sometimes an article or a book combines it with another topic. And so you're going to have to just pick out the pieces that are about your topic. And you can ignore the other pieces because they're not relevant for you. So synthesizing then is when we're doing that real in-depth reading of something. So now we've found the paragraphs that we need to focus on. We found the chapters that we need to focus on based on the other quicker methods of looking at a text. And now what do we do with those pieces of the text that we have realized, okay, we need to focus on this. This is relevant for me. And that would be synthesizing. So when we synthesize, it's an active process. So there's a reason it doesn't just say reading here. It's not just reading. It's combining what you read with your own ideas and kind of producing something new. So the word synthesis means to take two things and combine them to make something new. So you're going to be taking the information you've read and your own ideas and structure of the essay and putting them together, and the new product is your assignment. So when we synthesize, you're going to obviously read it fully now, the pieces that you've decided are relevant, but you're also going to be reading actively. So you need to start making notes, highlighting or underlining key points and key words. Often you can add notes to the margins and you can start summarizing. So summarizing what the crux of the text is, because all of these things are going to help you to put those ideas into your own words and eventually be able to use them in your particular assignment without accidentally plagiarizing and in a way that is actually useful. Because we don't want a summary of the things you read. We want you to use what you've read to make your own point. So before you can just use it to make a new point, you have to really understand it. And that's why it's important to start putting things into your own words, because that is what's going to help you to really understand something and be able to use it. And that's also where you're going to start being able to group ideas. So you might realize the same points have come up in a couple of texts. So at this point, you're going to start identifying the common themes in texts. You can start comparing them, and you might start identifying points that the texts disagree on. So this is where you're comparing what you have to what you already know, which may just be from your mind or from other texts. and starting to really see, how can I use this? How can I take what is written here and make something new? So those are the kind of options available when it comes to reading techniques. And there are a couple of different approaches to reading, right? So different ways to order those specific steps and add new steps. But the one I am going to focus on is the SQ3R reading method. So the S stands for skim, the Q stands for question, the first R is read, the second R is recite, and the third R is review. So we've already spoken about skimming on its own, but when you follow this question, read, recite, review steps, this is to help you actually synthesize, so to use the information for your own purposes. So this method is useful when you are reading important texts that you know you need to include in an assignment, but you're also going to use this for texts that you have to study. So if you have a test and your lecturer has told you to study chapter 1, 2, and 3, for instance, you would use this to read those chapters. And this would be a way to help you study, to help you remember the information in the texts that you had to study, and really be able to answer the questions and make sure you're answering them correctly, because it'll help you to understand the information. And so then a good idea, for instance, for test 3 in ACL would be to use this to really understand that article that is prescribed and that test 3 is going to be based on. So we're going to look at what each of these steps entail, and we're going to look at why we do it and why it's helpful. So we've already looked at skimming, and we've already looked at why we do it. But let's now have a bit of a look at an example. So let's have a look at the text. So this is not the one your test is based on. This is the text about postgraduate certificate in education students' views on teaching practice. So if we were to skim this, how would we do it? So I've taken page 1, page 5, and the last page of the article to use as an example. So let's look at how we would skim page 1. So remember, with skimming, we said the first thing we're going to look at with an article is the abstract. So the abstract is really useful for articles because it tells us the main idea of the text. So it's helpful when we're researching because it's going to tell us whether this text is relevant or not. But it's also helpful when we're reading something for study purposes, because if you have the main idea or the main argument in your head as you read the rest of the text, you're able to start understanding the author's argument a bit more clearly. You can start not seeing everything as just plain facts that are randomly linked together, but you can start seeing things as supporting details. And if you can reconstruct the author's argument, it makes it easier to remember. Now, a chapter in a book would usually not have this sort of abstract. So it's going to depend on the text, whether there is this sort of information available. But as I said, the introductions of books often have little summaries that are quite similar to abstracts. So in a book, you would try to read that. Then the next thing we're going to look at when we skim would be the titles, so the title of the text as a whole, and then the different headings and subheadings in the article. So in this case, the title is The Value of Teaching Practice as Perceived by Postgraduate Certificate in Education, or PGCE, students. So this is quite an informative title. It tells us exactly what this article is going to be about and exactly who the information was gathered from. So we already go into this article with a bit of a backstory in our heads. Not all articles have this sort of informative title. So Acting Like Acting would be an example of a title that is just not informative. You're not getting a lot out of it. But most journal articles will have a bit more of an informative title. And then you would go through the headings and the subheadings. Of course, the heading introduction doesn't tell us much. But as we move on in the text, you'll see there's often divisions into themes and sub-themes. And if you can identify the headings that are the kind of titles of themes, you start to realize, okay, these are going to be the main key points of this text. And then the thing that we add when we skim specifically is looking at the topic sentences. And this, as we've said, gives us the main idea of each paragraph. And it also helps us because we get to see the progression of ideas. So we see the path that the writer has taken to get to their final point. So now we already know the final point from the abstract. Now we see the steps that they took to get there by looking at those topic sentences. And again, when you can arrange something in your mind into, okay, this is the main conclusion and these are the steps to get there, it's much easier to remember than if you're just seeing it as a big chunk of information with no kind of logic to it. So these would be ways to obviously read an article for assignments so that you understand it. But you could do this sort of thing with a chapter in a textbook, because often your textbook is trying to explain something to you, right? So think, what is the main thing they're trying to explain? And what are the steps they took to get to that explanation? Then when you're in the test, it's a lot easier to remember, okay, these were the main steps, instead of just trying to parrot off the whole chapter, which would be impossible. When we skim, we also have a look at any kind of tables or graphs, because these are quite dense forms of information. And usually an author is not going to include a table or graph for no reason. It's usually there to summarize and highlight some key details that were really important for that text. So I know often we gloss over graphs and tables, especially when you're studying and it's test is tomorrow and you're just trying to get in as much as possible. But that is usually a big mistake, because the reason that particular table or graph is there is because it is there for key details. So even at the stage of skimming, we should pay a bit of attention. And at this point, you're not going to have a look at every piece of information or detail in this table, but you're going to make sure you can read it. So you're going to look at it and say, okay, what is this about? In this case, it is about the demographic data of the participants. So what does that mean? Well, it would be the identifying information of the people they got the data from. So in this case, those postgraduate certificate in education students. Because remember, from the title told us who the data came from. So the participants must be those students. And once you're satisfied, you can read it, you know what's going on quite roughly, you would then carry on skimming the topic sentences after that particular graph or table. So we're also going to have a look at the conclusion when we do this exercise of skimming. So remember, we said the introduction and conclusion are specifically important here. In journal articles specifically, the conclusion is the kind of crux, the take home message of the article. So the main idea is explained in the conclusion, and the significance. So remember, significance is what should happen in the real world. So the conclusion can tell us what the main point was. In a textbook chapter, often the conclusion will also just reiterate the key points that were explained in that chapter. So if you then have that in your mind as you go through the chapter in more detail, it's a lot easier to pick up on those main points and focus your studying on those instead of irrelevant details. Okay, so that is skimming. So remember, this is a method for reading. So we would do all of these steps in order to read one text. So we've skimmed the text. Now we can start to question it. So when we question, we turn the headings and subheadings into questions. And then we write down any additional questions that pop into our head in the margins if you have a photocopy of the text, or you could do it on a separate piece of scrap paper. And this is important because it helps us keep a clear sense of purpose when you're reading. So often when you read something, you're kind of glossing over it and your attention can wander. So you've read something and then you go back and you can't remember what you've read. When we focus our mind on particular questions, it helps us keep that focus and not let our minds go on a little journey where we think we've read it, but actually we weren't concentrating at all. In terms of assignments, it's useful because if you start to think, okay, what questions do I have that aren't being answered? It helps you realize what you need to research further. So it'll help you figure out what sort of information you should look for to add to this article and eventually add to your assignment. So let's have a look at this page, page 6 of that article. So here you can see this page has a lot of different subheadings and they're quite informative. It's really the themes of the research. So career choice, intrinsic value, and then subheadings would be emotions, attitudes, etc. So if we wanted to turn these into questions, this would be how we would do it. So we simply take the heading or subheading, and then we make it into a question to ask ourselves. So why do students see teaching practice as valuable to others? It's a really simple process. But the reason it's useful is now when you read that paragraph, your mind will look for those answers and it will help you to keep that sense of focus. Here we can see with the heading, we could ask something like, which particular aspects of teaching practice have intrinsic value? So now our mind will focus on looking for information about what parts of teaching practice are important, instead of just like vaguely reading everything. And then we could also turn the next subheading into a question. And then often in this process of making these questions, you start to think of your own questions. So your own things that you don't yet understand or that the text hasn't addressed. So you would then start jotting down your own personal questions as well. And those would then help you to either find further research in an assignment or if you see that you are studying something, but you have a lot of unanswered questions, that would be the time that you need to go speak to your lecturer and ask for assistance. You don't want to realize that you had all these unanswered questions in the test, or never realize at all that you had these gaps in your understanding. And then when it comes to the test, you think you've answered correctly, but actually you hadn't understood. So this questioning process is useful for helping to figure out what you know, what you don't know, but also just focusing the mind, making sure that as you're reading, you're looking for answers to questions, just helps you to concentrate and not just forget what you've read. So when you question, we kind of first start by turning the headings and subheadings into questions. This is before we even read the text. But then as we're reading, you're going to start adding the questions based on what you need further information about. And so in terms of the reading, we're starting now to read only after we've done the whole skimming process and only after we've turned the headings into questions. So when we read, we're not reading passively. We're not just letting the information wash over us. Because we've had these questions, we've turned the headings into questions, it helps us to have more of a conversation with the text. So it's almost like you're interviewing the text. The text is something alive, and you're asking it questions and getting out the answers. And that is going to help you to remember the information and to understand it, and to also link it with information you already know. So as we read, you're basically looking for the answers to those questions you created based on the headings. And you're also going to start annotating. So annotating is when we mark up the text. So you add notes to the margin, you could highlight particular aspects of it. The reason we do this is also to keep our reading active. So if we're making notes, highlighting, we're not just kind of letting the information wash over us, we're involved. And to make it easier to find information later. So if there's an important point and you underline it, if you come back, it's much easier to find it. So many students would simply highlight. And I would caution you against this, because sometimes when we do that, we just highlight the whole page. And that didn't really serve much except for wasting an entire highlighter. So highlight sparingly, make sure you're only highlighting really key points. But highlighting can also be passive. Like you almost lull yourself into a stage where you're just absent-mindedly highlighting. It's a bit like coloring in at that point. So the real thing you need to be doing is forcing yourself to be active. So forcing yourself to search for the answers to those questions that you created, and writing. So either writing in the margins or in a notebook. So you need to be doing something as you read, not just letting it wash over you. So if we were now to actively read this specific piece of work, remember we would have turned our heading into a question. So we could say something like, what were the student teachers' experiences like? So that is the question. So now we're going to start looking for our answers. And immediately we see negative experiences. So that starts to answer our question. Okay, their experiences were bad. They weren't good. And we can see the subpoints, the reasons their experiences were bad, were when they felt that teachers were not helpful, when they didn't prepare, or when they didn't understand the theory. But as we keep reading, we see that some of them had good experiences. So we see that there's a bit of a mixed bag here. There are positive and negative experiences. So when we answer our question, what were their experiences like? We can say, well, there were some experiences that were good and some experiences that were bad. And we've identified the specific experiences that were good and bad. So the bad ones, the not helpful, own lack of preparation, lack of understanding of theory were the bad ones. And the good experiences were respectful learners and being able to realize the work that goes into teaching. But here we could start to generate our own question about the text, right? So we've turned the headings into questions. Now we're reading. But I would start to question, well, learning that teaching is hard work, is that actually a positive experience or is that a negative experience? It's being classed here as a positive experience, a good experience, but I'm not sure if that would actually be the case. So, depending on a particular topic of an assignment, you might want to start researching more information about what student teachers think about the work involved in teaching. So here you can see we've distinguished between the big, sorry. Okay, so we've distinguished between the kind of main points, so the fact that there were some negative experiences and some good experiences, and we've circled them. And then the sub-points, the more supporting details and extra information are highlighted. So you would work out your own system, right? Maybe you use 2 different colors. Maybe some things you circle, some things you underline. Maybe you have a notebook and you're jotting down notes. So you'll have, the main point, negative experiences, and then bullet points for the specific examples. You need to try and figure out what's going to work for you. I like to mark up text, so I do this sort of thing where I'll circle the main points, highlight the subpoints, and then you can start to label things as well. So this whole thing in italics is just quotes from the participants. So we could mark that up. Okay, this is just evidence to back up these claims. This is not something really to focus on unless I realize in my assignment I want to refer to an example. And you can start also looking up the definitions or explanations of terms that you don't really understand. So, for instance, if you saw this SIC in square brackets and you didn't know what that meant, it would be a good time to Google it and to figure out, okay, what does this mean? So that you can just jot that down in the margins. Then when you're reading the text again or carry on, you now know, okay, this is what that means. In this case, the reason we would include SIC in square brackets like that is if we've quoted and there was a grammatical error in the quote, and so you put the SIC to tell your reader, okay, I know there's a grammatical error here, but it was in the original quote, so I've left it as is. So in this case, knowing that isn't super helpful to our understanding of the piece or paragraph as a whole. But sometimes you'll find when you see key terms that you don't understand, if you don't go and research them and get the definition, you won't be able to understand the paragraph. So I really encourage you when you're reading something and you see things you don't understand to look them up and make sure that you take note of that sort of thing. So then after we have read and we've read actively, we move on to the recite section. So that is when we are going to start making our own summaries and paraphrasing. So remember when I was telling you about paraphrasing, I said the first thing we do is you just write the main idea and the supporting ideas of whatever section you're trying to paraphrase without looking at the text. So this is just another word for doing that. So recite, we're going to start writing our notes about the text without looking at the text. And we're going to focus on those topic sentences, the main points, as we did when we were talking about paraphrasing, and distinguishing those from the supporting details. And the reason we're going to do this is because if we just copy out from the text, usually you don't remember it. So putting it into your own words, so when you identify the main idea, the supporting details, and then can explain it in your own words, that is putting it into your long-term memory. So that's what's going to help you remember information for a test. The other reason we're going to do it is to make sure we understand it. So if you are getting to a point where you're writing it out in your own words and you realize I can't actually do this, it means you probably haven't understood what you read. So you need to go back, look up terms, make sure that you can read it a few times until you understand and can put it in your own words. Because being able to put something in your own words and explain it to someone else is kind of the marker of understanding something. And of course, the other reason we do this is to help us to paraphrase and avoid plagiarism. The final step is to review. So this is when we go back and we check what we wrote, what we paraphrased against the original text. So you're checking, first of all, have I accidentally plagiarized? Have I accidentally just written the same words? And if you have, you need to change that. The next thing you're going to check is, have you included all the important information? Have you left anything out? Because if you have, you need to add that. You also might realize that you changed the meaning completely when you tried to write it in your own words. And if you've done that, you don't want to learn or use the wrong information. So you would need to go back and check, have I still kept the same meaning, even though I've put it in my own words? And this is important because it helps you to make sure you've got accurate notes. So an assignment that is accurate, or notes to study from that are accurate. So you're not learning the wrong information. And because it can just help you reinforce your understanding of the text. So those are the steps involved in the SQ3R method. So I would encourage you to at least try this, see if it helps you. If you realize it's not for you, there are other reading methods and you are welcome to research them and use them. The important thing is that you're not just reading. So you're not just glossing over a page and that's it. The important thing here is using these steps forces you to read actively, and ultimately that's going to help you score better in tests and to do better in assignments. So it is time consuming. It does take work, but it's work that pays off because it is what's going to help you really understand a text and really be able to remember it so that you can refer to it or talk about it in a test situation. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this and then move on to looking at one of the journal articles in a bit more detail. But as I figure out how to do that, if there are any questions, you can pop your hand up or put them in the chat on the live stream. Okay. So, as I said before, this is the text that is going to be the focus of your test 3. So, this one I would really recommend that you go through it with that SQ3R method to really understand it, because you're going to need to understand it in order to really score well in that test. Can you just give me indication who has their course reader with them? Okay. So it looks like most of us. I will also display on screen. Let's just get to a point where we can actually see. And I think what we can maybe do now is start with that first step, and then we can start talking about what that reveals to us. So the first step, remember, is to skim. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to skim through this text. So start by looking at the title and the subheadings and headings, obviously our abstract, our topic sentences, and the conclusion. And then you would be able to then tell me the gist of the article, and we can kind of get on the same page there, and you can complete the rest of the steps at home. So in this case, remember, the introduction includes the literature review. There is no separate section. So here, the introduction is quite long. Here, you would just read the first paragraph of the introduction as part of your skimming step. If you're struggling to see the screen and you didn't bring your course reader, you can move forward. There's a lot of space there. Sorry? I think it doesn't have pages. I think it's the second to last one. Oh, it's the middle of the book. I'll come show you. Do you mind if I touch? All right, so we're looking at the title, the abstract, and the first paragraph of the introduction. If you're relying on the screen, you can just give me an indication when we need to move on. If you have your course reader, you can obviously work at your own pace. Okay. So now that we've looked at the title, what does the title tell us about what we're going to read? Who is this article going to be about? In terms of the title, what does it reveal? So, female principals. So, again, we have quite an informative title that really indicates where the data is going to come from. In terms of that abstract, what do you think the key conclusions are going to be? The main points. And are there any terms that you don't understand or that you would need to start questioning and getting the answer? Okay, let's do hands up. Any terms that we don't understand? Yes? Or are we all good? Trajectory? Okay. So, trajectory, it's more of a term to do with motion. So, it's kind of moving forward. So, as they move forward through their career in this context. Do you remember what qualitative means? So, it says it's a qualitative study. So, there's two types of studies, quantitative and qualitative. We spoke about it last time. Quantitative is when the data in the study is numbers, it's countable. So quantitative, quantity, numbers. Qualitative comes from quality, and it would be more about details and words and interviews and that sort of thing. So, qualitative study, we know immediately that this study is not about gathering numbers, it's about gathering people's words. Sure. Interdisciplinary. So, in research and higher education, there are different disciplines. So, we would say education is a discipline, psychology is a discipline, sociology is a discipline. So, we all kind of divide up into things that we study and research. When something is interdisciplinary, they refer to more than one discipline. So in this case, they are going to refer to obviously the discipline of education. So that would be all the kind of theoretical underpinnings that we all learn when we study education. And they also refer to some kind of sociology and philosophy theoretical underpinnings. So they're referring to more than one discipline. And of course, psychology. They refer to the discipline of psychology. So, as you can see, just going through this abstract, there's a lot of questions, right? So, this is where in the next stage, you would start writing out those questions and looking for the answers. So, perhaps In this case, you can just ask me. But if I'm not there reading with you, you would start to think, okay, let me go Google this or look it up in a dictionary to make sure you understand what's going on. What do you think the introduction reveals to us? So remember, we're just looking at the first paragraph of the introduction in the skimming step. True. Yeah. So she said this first paragraph, really the main crux of it is that education is important for breaking the cycle of poverty. So education plays this important function in many people's lives. So let's now try and relate this to what we know already about what this article is going to be about. So we know it's going to be about female school principals. And we know that in terms of the abstract, our main points are that female principals have to be prepared theoretically, practically, and psychologically for principalship, and that mentoring was something that they had found valuable in helping them to do this. So the abstract has already told us those are the two key findings. So how do we link up this piece of background information about education and the cycle of poverty to what we already know about what this article is about? Why are they telling us this whole thing about education and the cycle of poverty? Oh, okay. Well, it hasn't turned off, so we're still in the clear. I should not wear tops with sleeves like this. Yeah. Okay. So, does anyone want to answer that? Why do we think they've told us this little piece of information about education and poverty? Yeah. So it's to emphasize why education is important. So if we even link that further, why principals are important, right? Because they play a big role in running schools. We can also maybe start to predict things like, well, perhaps this would be a reason why the role has a lot of pressure attached to it, and why they're saying things like you need to be psychologically ready for principalship. So at this point, we're just predicting. So when we skim, we need to start predicting what we think it's going to be about and start asking questions in the next stage based on these kind of vague predictions. At this point, we can't get a really definite answer, but try to start predicting, because that again keeps you reading actively instead of forgetting what you've written. So then with our skimming, we would start reading the first sentences of each paragraph. So this is something we can do quite quickly. We're just reading the first sentence of each paragraph here. And we would continue doing this onto the next page. But as we move on out of that introduction, we're going to start taking note of our headings and subheadings as well. So here we have theoretical framework, research methodology. So remember what we learned in the previous lecture about the way that a journal article is divided up. This would be the next big section of the journal article, would be the methodology section, where we would find the answers to who, what, where, how, in terms of the actual study that was done. And then in this article, the findings and discussion sections, which are big, the other big parts of a journal article, are combined. So we can already take note of that. So what are we going to expect? Well, they're going to tell us what they found and immediately interpret it. Whereas if the findings and discussion section were separate, we would expect in the findings section, they will just tell us what the data revealed, summarize it, and then in the discussion section, interpret it. Whereas now, because they are combined, those two things are going to get mixed. And here we can start to see themes. So we would take note of the main themes. So here the first theme is formative experiences. Then we can take note of the second theme, which is being prepared, which we already saw came out in that first part of our skimming in the abstract. And then we can start to notice here there's a lot of text that is in italics. So what is this italics text? Sorry? Thoughts. Extracts. It's extracts from the interviews. But thank you for trying. So yes, these are what the principals they interviewed said. So they're using these as examples to illustrate whatever main point they're making under the theme. So they're giving us examples as evidence. So remember, in the finding sections, they're trying to convince us this was the main finding, this is how we should interpret it, and they will use these extracts from the interviews to prove or give evidence for that particular finding and interpretation. So we've looked at theme 2. Here is theme 3, which is decision making dynamics. Theme 4 is about mentoring, which again, we already knew was going to come up from our abstract. So those are our 4 themes. So now when we come back and read, we would realize, okay, those are the main issues I'm going to interact with. And then we get our conclusion and recommendations. So have a quick read of the conclusion. If you need to come forward, please do so. You've stopped. Has everyone read the first little bit? Because then I can zoom in on the second. So what? Let's start with an easy question. What are their recommendations? So they recommend tangible support. So what do they mean? Tangible support. What does tangible mean? So tangible, the pure definition is something I can touch. So in this case, what they mean, I think, is like physical means of support. So give them, office space, classroom space, money to get textbooks, that sort of thing. Because they're contrasting it with tangible support and psychological support, which would be intangible. You can't touch someone's mental well being or thoughts. So they're saying we need kind of these physical means of support and ways to help people cope psychologically, which would be a more intangible means of support. We can also see here in the first part of the conclusion, there's the recap of those main themes. So we've seen them now highlighted in the abstract, in the text itself as headings, and in the conclusion. So when we go into reading this, we really know that these are the main points. But they also highlight their interpretation of those themes or main points in this little section, the section before the recommendations. So this is more of a comment on the study itself and the way that they did the study and what it means in terms of kind of where the study was situated. So in the conclusion, what we've got is a recap of those main points, a comment on some of the main kind of points about resilience and what this means for where the study was situated, and our recommendations. So in light of this and the abstract, we should all have figured out by now that the idea of resilience has come up a lot. That word keeps coming up. So resilience was there in the abstract. And here they're saying really that one of the main things that came out of the research was ways to develop resilience mechanisms. And some examples were spirituality and women mobilizing other women. And then if we look at the recommendations, these are actually ways that resilience could be further improved. So resilience has come up a lot. Do we understand what resilience means? Yes? No? Maybe? Half, half? Okay. Resilience is when you're able to kind of tackle adversity and not fall apart. So, can you deal with stressful situations or hard circumstances and still keep going forward and get the job done? That's resilience. So, at this point, we've already figured out there were a couple of terms that needed to be defined, that we needed to make sure we understood. So, you can see how the different steps of the SQ3R method bleed into each other. As you're skimming, you're starting to realize, okay, these are some questions that I need to ask. And after we're done skimming, those kind of main themes that we identified while skimming would then also become other questions. Then when we get to reading, those questions that we did in the previous step guide the reading. So the steps bleed into each other. So what I encourage you to do now is finish skimming if you didn't, and then go through the other stages of the SQ3R method for this article, because this is actually a nice test run. It'll help you to study this article for test 3, which you have to do anyway. And you can use this as a little experiment to see, does this method work for me? Do I get anything out of this? Is this helping me? So that is your homework before the next lecture, is to really, start experimenting with that method and see if it helps you. So we're finishing a little early. Oh, no, we're not. I thought we were. We're finishing 5 minutes early. So if anyone has any questions that you want to ask me, feel free to come to the front. As always, I'm available on email. So if you need help, send me an email. If you need help, but you don't know how to put it into an email because it's not that type of question, send me an email and say, can we have an appointment? I'm always happy to do appointments with you if you have things that you're struggling with. So you can email me your questions or just tell me you want an appointment. So I'm here to help you if you need it. Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a good day.